Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and I just got back from the new film, Life Itself. When you look at a film like Life Itself, it's pretty easy to understand how a documentary about the most famous film critic of all time would get fairly good reviews from film critics. And you might think maybe it's getting a pass. I kind of wondered that myself before I saw this film. As beloved as Ebert is, and as good of a critic as he was, and even though this film is directed by Steve James, who directed Hoop Dreams, it is kind of like such a slam dunk. I would think, critically, just a decent documentary would probably get pretty good reviews. But Life Itself is a lot more than just kind of a simple Ebert biography documentary, mostly because of Steve James. But I think it also kind of is, and it's organized in a way cutting between the story of his life through video clips and stories from Ebert's memoirs, also called Life Itself. This isn't a film version of the book, which I think originally when this was announced it kind of sounded like it was. It's kind of a different film unto itself, because you're cutting between hearing about his life and his time as a print critic, and then his time on television and his celebrity and everything like that, and you're cutting between that and what was going on with him the last few months of his life, going in and out of rehab centers and hospitals and seeing the twilight of his life. And that makes it more impactful. But I think Steve James was smart enough to understand the thing about Ebert is he's a populist critic, and there's no way to escape that with him. And he was very good at being able to sum up why a movie was good, not just for me and for other critics and people who are lovers of film and into film, but also for people who I remember when I was a kid, and him and Siskel are pretty much how I'm to understand who critics were at that time. He's kind of how you know film criticism, especially in my age and around the time his show was on. That's how you understood what it was. Some suburban mom who would be talking about Chicken Soup for the Teenage Soul the minute before, but now they're talking about how they heard Princess Mononoke has a really engrossing plot. He was able to bridge that gap between the normal person and film criticism. That's why this film is the way it is, because what Steve James has done is, this isn't a hard documentary to get into, but it really shouldn't be, because that would be kind of against who Ebert really was. It gets to the soul of the man, because the man was someone who, he was a nationally syndicated film critic, he had a hit syndicated TV show. Steve James does it in a way that makes it so you can see the kind of person Ebert was, but also appeal to the people who were into him, who weren't just film critics. I don't think this kind of a film would work with any other critic. There are certainly other critics that could probably use the documentary treatment, but the way this was made works for Ebert, because it's both uncompromising in what it shows of him in the latter part of his life, but it also kind of gives you that regular documentary feel that you expect from a more digestible documentary crowd. And Steve James seems to be able to go between that in a way that makes this a lot more than one of those films. I used to love Ebert, and then I got more into other critics. Every critic's going to have a review that you're not going to like, and that's kind of the nature of the business, because it's unlike any other art form, really. You kind of have to go out there every week, and it doesn't matter if you feel like you're on your toes or you can put out your best work. You kind of just have to go out there, and sometimes you're not going to write the greatest review. And there's reviews of his I've absolutely hated, and there's reviews of his that have honestly surprised me when I'd given up faith in him completely. I don't know if he is as instrumental in me being a critic now as he would have been if I was a teenager. Cale was kind of more someone who influenced how I make these reviews, but Ebert, I actually kind of stole the structure of the Ebert in the movies and elaborated on it for a lot of reviews at times. He's definitely someone who is influential to me, but I'm also always been a little apprehensive of that influence. And I don't think Ebert was someone who only believed in just his criticism. He says very fond things about Pauline Kael. He always has. The other talking heads in the film don't portray her in the greatest light, which I don't agree with, and I don't know if he would agree with. And I kind of wondered after I left, would they have kept that in the film had he lived? And how they would kind of thumb their nose at New York critics who were pretty big at the time. But I think Ebert even agrees with the criticism of the thumbs up and thumbs down, but he also understood context. Though one clip that they didn't show that I wish they had is a clip from Ebert and Roper, which this film doesn't really get into the latter part of what happened to the Siskel and Ebert show after Siskel had died, unfortunately. I don't think that's incredibly necessary. That's kind of a side plot, maybe on the DVD or something. So you don't get Ignati, you don't get Roper, you don't get Ben Lyons, you don't get any of that. I kind of thought that would have been interesting, but they don't seem to want to get into that at all. Roper complained, how come War of the Worlds got a thumbs down? I think The Honeymooners got a thumbs up. And he was saying, like, you know, star systems, you have to understand the context, and how War of the Worlds, he was comparing it to Steven Spielberg's earlier work, and The Honeymooners, he's comparing it to a different kind of film. And I wish they'd played that clip, probably. That's probably the only Roper clip I would have argued should be in there. The other part of this film is Gene Siskel. I've read other people say how he's a supporting actor pretty much in this film. And you get a bit of his biographical information about Gene Siskel. I didn't know he traveled the world with Hugh Hefner and was friends with Hugh Hefner. I had no clue about that. I really didn't know much about Gene Siskel's background. Come to think of it, another clip, I would have liked some clips from The Critic cartoon, that Siskel and Ebert's only cartoon appearance. I think that would have been nice, but you know, maybe it was a rights issue, I don't know. I've seen most of those clips many times, and all the famous clips, Steve James used them in a great way to illustrate the history of that show, and even kind of showing how Siskel was getting slower towards the end and quieter, and you could tell he was sick. I always thought at the time he was just getting older, but he was obviously sick apparently. I like how they show that, and they show the history of Siskel and Ebert. You get kind of the cliff notes of it. I don't know if you really get how the show was and how much they both would love a film, but you got the arguments and the tension, and you get this real sense of that view and how criticism, I think a lot of people who are online now and a lot of the people who are making movie reviews owe a large debt to that show, maybe more than the ones who refuse it even realize, because I don't think a lot of criticism on TV was not that way. With Life Itself, it kind of shows how kind of remarkable he was as a person and how much he accomplished and how big and great of a critic he was. You kind of get more of the full scope of it than you'd really expect from a film like this. You even have people who wrote major essays against him and Siskel and Ebert being talking heads in this film. And it does feel like sometimes they get people who I'm surprised would be almost as complimentary, but I think it shows how major of a part he was to film criticism. There are tons of times where you look at him and look at critics from New York or LA or anywhere else and think of him more as the populist kind of Midwestern critic, and I think he would like that. I think he would like this kind of documentary, and he had no qualms thinking about how that wouldn't be cool or anything like that. That never was important to him. It talks more about his life than how he advanced filmmaking and got more people into certain directors and certain films. But it does talk about how he helped younger, smaller filmmakers and would show up to screenings, and how connected he was, and how he had this lengthy career from the man who won the Pulitzer Prize to then being on TV, his disastrous runs of TV, then having a big show, then going on social media. It kind of goes over how big of a personality he really was, whether you like him or not, what he kind of represented to film criticism, but also how he's not afraid to go into the things that you criticize him for. A lot of times you read about a critic and they get criticized and it feels like, you know, a real dagger in their heart. And it didn't seem to bother him as much that he has people who are talking heads who aren't incredibly complimentary. And certainly his arguments with Siskel and that relationship seemed, they call it radioactive at one point. That kind of shows the kind of guy he was. And as much as he was kind of this more populist critic and was the kind of critic who people would talk about in their suburban living rooms and be able to be syndicated and be on at 7 o'clock on a Sunday and things like that. Every now and then I'd always go over to his site and read a review, and I'd always be kind of surprised to be like, wow, you know, for every one I totally hate and think he's just trying to churn one out, every now and then he'd pull one out. Wow, that's a damn good review. And the thing about him and how big of a thing he had on culture was like this kept showing him, kept going. Herzog has that great part where he's talking about how he's like a soldier of cinema and he keeps surviving even without his voice. The funny thing is about this movie, it's a little weird that I feel the most incomplete part about Life Itself is that I don't get a review from Roger Ebert. It's been over a year definitely since he died. That sometimes still happens where I'll think, oh, I wonder what he would have said. And even if I knew it wasn't going to be something I liked, when I realized like that's not going to happen, that's never going to happen again. It kind of showed what a workhorse he was and how he made more reviews than anybody, even now. Very few people make that many reviews. That kind of is an inspiration to any film critic, how many he made. When he is getting closer and closer to death, it did make me think about, oh, I'll never hear what he thought of this movie. And that's kind of the saddest part, is because Life Itself, when you think about Ebert, I think we knew him best through his reviews and through all the clips we get through that. I think it helps the most. They have excerpts from his various reviews and they have clips from his show with Siskel. That's how we knew him best, and I think this film does that while also showing the man and the parts of him we didn't know and giving that full picture. Maybe that full picture feels incomplete without that review, but I think that's kind of how it ended, so that's kind of how it has to end. He'd been writing about film for half the existence of cinema, and I think that's the hardest thing, is that he was such a big part of movies and supportive of so many people and supportive of so many things. This is kind of it for him. I think this is the last new thing we'll ever see from him, and I think that's the saddest part. In a way, you look at Life Itself and you have to realize that for all its faults, and maybe this isn't the weirdest or coolest documentary, and it isn't like the greatest made documentary in the world, but when this kind of a documentary works, it can work wonders and it can appeal to people and get people into certain things that I don't think they ordinarily would. And I think that's exactly what Roger Ebert did. And I think Life Itself does that as magnificently as Ebert himself did. So if you have seen Life Itself and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.